Right, so just to give you a short introduction to my speech now, I'm going to be speaking about climate change, global warming, and more particularly CO2 emissions. And there are a few things I'm going to mention which you might want to think up in your own languages. I'm sure you know the solutions already. Shale gas, in the news a lot nowadays, and I'm going to be speaking about a report that I read about in a newspaper. Okay, ready? Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to speak to you today about a few topics that I'm sure you're all too familiar with. I'd like to speak to you about climate change, global warming, and CO2 emissions. Unfortunately, these topics come up all too frequently in the news, and rarely has the media got anything good to say on the topics. It seems, unfortunately, that our planet is heating up at quite a fast pace, and there is no way within our grasp that we can slow this down. The main problem at the end of the day is that we all want to improve our own lives. We all want better well-being. We all want to see economic growth in our countries, and we all want to enjoy greater prosperity in our lives. However, in order to achieve this, we need to produce a great deal of energy. And if we want to produce energy, then of course, with this comes a great deal of emissions. So today I opened the newspaper and as I was saying, once again, the topic of CO2 emissions came up. But in the report that I read today, in the newspaper article I read today, the news was actually slightly positive. There was a hint of hope to it. And so we can actually see that there are news items that come up which go against the grain, which actually oppose the usual trend of what we see in the newspapers every day. That is, us being told time and again that climate change is unstoppable and it's just getting worse and worse. So what was this glimmer of hope that we saw in that I read about in the paper? Well, I'll tell you about it in a few minutes, because whenever there's a piece of good news, unfortunately, it's always accompanied by a piece of bad news as well. And as is the custom, whenever someone is given the choice of choosing between the good news or the bad news, they always choose the bad news first. So here's the bad news. The report and its findings told us that the world's CO2 emissions in 2012 reached a record high for that year in comparison with previous years. This means that if we take the year 2012 and compare it with every single year that has ever come before it in the history of the universe, we have never been emitting so much CO2 as that year. And as usual, the polluters are the same old culprits. The emitters are always the same old large, wealthy countries. The United States, China, and of course, here, the European Union. The report also points out that some countries are continuing with their same old bad habits. For example, my country, the UK, is seeing its coal consumption rising. And this should not be the case nowadays when we are all trying to reduce the use of fossil fuels that we have. So there you go, that's the bad news. You can now rest at ease because now we have the good news. So the main finding of the report that I read about was actually that global CO2 emissions are now increasing at a significantly slower rate than they have up until now, or in recent years. So of course, this doesn't mean that emissions are actually decreasing. Far from it. They are still rising, and there is no real possibility, no sign that they will start falling in the near future. This piece of news simply means that emissions are rising at a slower rate than they were in the past. So what are the reasons for this slower increase? Well, we could look at the world on a whole and bring up a few reasons, a few key points. Firstly, that people around the world are trying to make an effort to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels. Also, governments are promoting renewable energies to a greater extent than they were in the past. And we are, on the whole, trying to all make savings in the energy that we consume. We could also look at the cases of specific countries. We could look at China, for example, where energy now relies to a greater degree on hydroelectric dams as opposed to more polluting means of producing energy. The increase that we saw in CO2 emissions in China for 2012 was only 3%, whereas in the last few years, the last 5 years roughly, this increase has been of 10% year on year. Then we could turn our eyes towards the European Union. Now, as you're all more than aware, the EU has been going through a recession for the last few years, or at least most of the countries in the EU have, and this has meant that people have been travelling less, so less road transport, which means fewer emissions. Also, industrial production has been slowing slightly in the EU, and so this is all, although it may be bad for our pockets, it may be bad for our economies, it is nevertheless good for our environment. And then if we turn our eyes towards the United States, we can see that the shale revolution has taken hold. Shale gas, as you're probably aware, if you follow the news, is a recent possible solution to many of the energy problems we have. Now, there are a great deal of drawbacks to shale gas. We're all aware of the damage that fracking can cause. And in many European countries, there is great opposition to shale gas extraction, so much so that it is outlawed in many places. But in the United States, it is indeed legal. And we can now see that shale gas is helping the United States to be more environmentally friendly. So, as I've been saying, this report outlines the situation as we are now, comparing it with the past, looking at the emissions that we have nowadays and comparing these with previous years. But the report also considers the future. The report concludes by saying that if these trends are to continue, if these positive trends, the ones I've mentioned of an increase in renewable energy, an increase in energy savings, and a reduction in fossil fuel consumption, if all of this continues, then we will possibly even start to see a reduction in our CO2 emissions. But I have to say, the report, although it tries to give a glimmer of hope, it's not really promising in the sense that it outlines the fact that we're never really going to, there's not really the immediate possibility of us bringing about a true reduction in our CO2 emissions. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to finish on that negative point. Thank you.